community, ensuring that we all increase in truth, freedom, and love. In a world that is filled with apathy and slavery and lies, we want to provide people with access to, realistic and dynamic ways to address the concerns they have in their mental health, in their relationships, in their marriages, families, in the growing cultural landscape that we experience. So I appreciate you joining us today. And on today's episode, we're going to really talk about the desperation that people face when they choose to divorce, especially people of faith, especially Catholic people. Because for Catholics, divorce is something that oftentimes we're terribly opposed to, and yet we know that people that are Catholic still get divorced. I mean, the rate of divorce is around almost 60% right now. So we really want to, today give people hope, help people to navigate that challenging landscape right now. And, if you are joining us for the first time on the podcast, one of the best ways you can support us is by, clicking subscribe. If you've never subscribed before, please do. It helps us to bump up the interest in the algorithms. Also, if you find that the content on this podcast is useful to you, give us a 5-star review. Again, the more people that can find it and spread these, this information and this hope in the community and in the family and in your workplace, the better. So those are one of the best ways that you can, support the podcast. Tell somebody about it. Subscribe. If you're watching us on YouTube, if you're watching us, if you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the vehicles by which we're transmitting this podcast. Again, it's something that I want to continue to do to give you access to information that otherwise, people, have to pay money for, or it's hard to get access to it. Remember, what is most transmitted in social media and in most of the, the circuits here of, social media and podcasting, a lot of the stuff is just very negative things. What goes viral is things that makes people angry, right? So, again, I really love it if you subscribe or give us a 5-star review. If not, listen in, and thank you just for joining us. I want to give a shout out real quick before I jump into the program to those that support this podcast. One is Mezzanine Creative. If you go to mezzanine.co, you'll find that the people over at Mezzanine Creative, they help with graphic design for your small business for branding purposes. They've done an excellent job with our banners and our graphics we are using on this podcast, both on YouTube and Spotify and as well as Apple Podcasts. So if you like the designs from Mezzanine, check them out. They'd love to help you, especially with the graphic design to have your business branded well. Also, support of this podcast is Buffalo Chesterton Academy. If you go to buffalochestertonacademy.org, you can find their school. This podcast is recorded, and I live in the Buffalo, New York region. So that is a classical school. In classical school, I probably will do a whole podcast on, but it is to develop the whole person and, to really to utilize the forgotten and very, sometimes it seems like these forgotten secrets of education as education continues to, I guess, go into a state of collapse, it would seem, right? The educational system seems like it's failing. Classical education seems to be blossoming. So if you want to check out what classical education is, and again, buffalochestertonacademy.org. And again, it is a Catholic high school, so a classical education and a classical high school. And if you are looking for a Chesterton Academy near you, you can always, there's a link in the show notes for you to, find one or even start to create one in your neck of the woods. There's growing Chesterton, academies all over the country and all over the world, because people want to be exposed to the classics in literature and in philosophy and in history, and really to gain perspective in the time in which they live. And that really helps them to synthesize material very well and develops the whole person. So check that out. And then the lastly, but not least, is heartsrenewed.org. And Hearts Renewed is an online marriage transformation program. It took me about 7 years for me to really gather up all the research and information to combine for people the best practices in marital and couples counseling, and then remove myself from that. So it is a marriage transformation program, not just an enrichment program. And the language there is crafted so that you have positive conversations every time you use the program, and that you generate and co-create with your spouse the type of marriage that you want to be in, right? So a lot of people, again, years ago, especially during COVID, people were not able to access couples counseling. A lot of Catholic marriages, just like mainstream marriages, struggle, as we'll talk about today. And sometimes their spouse doesn't want counseling. Their spouse just is very upset. People are worried about their privacy. People are worried about a third person being involved in their marriage. People are concerned about, childcare. They're worried about the money that will cost. And so we try to get rid of all of the excuses as to why people cannot really attend to their marriage and spend their effort and their time and their money in the best way possible and with the least risk, right? Because when you get another person involved in your marriage and you do couples work, which I think is invaluable for many people, you want to make sure that that person is going to encourage and foster the best outcomes. And so this is a program that I would hope that people take advantage of. And, right now you can try the program by just, go to heartsrenewed.org and you type in the code RENEW1 and you'll be able to try the whole program for 7 days for $1. So that's less than a cup of coffee. And again, even if you do one exercise, again, a lot of people do this program or they purchase this program and they do one exercise and they are shocked by the kind of conversation they have. Because the interventions, the healing or the transformation is a byproduct of the conversations you will have with your spouse. And if you are unable to get your spouse involved in this work, it's also excellent for someone to do solo. So if you're a married man or a married woman, but your wife or your husband will not participate just yet, try the program, look at the information, let it inspire you. Many people have said that it has inspired them and helped them to get their spouse more and more involved, engaged in having these conversations. We want conversations that convert into the types of marriages that are attractive. Okay? And so that is the topic for today. Today we are going to be talking about, really like, well, what is it, that makes good people get a divorce and how to avoid that and why that seems to occur for people. Because everybody that's listening to this podcast knows people that have surprised them when they've decided all of a sudden, call it quits. They were shocked. It could be a family member. It could be a brother-in-law, sister-in-law, maybe their own parents. And you see their marriages just implode. And why is that? And, also, how can we avoid that? And especially when we are in a desperate, dire strait. So to start off, I want to tell you a story. Maybe I've told this story on the podcast before. I don't necessarily recall if I have or not. But when I was a young boy, probably 7 or 8, my family had a regular vacation. We would go out and we would see my uncle, and my uncle lived in Kentucky, and he had a large parcel of property. And in the morning, I would get up, and my cousins and myself, my younger brother, or my uncle would go out. We would walk around the property, and I thought it was cool. I was more of a city kid, so to be out in the country was, at that age, like exciting to me. And I remember on this one time we were visiting my uncle. We were walking through the woods, and my uncle was a quiet man, and he pointed over to a trap. If you can imagine one of those old metal traps on the ground, and inside the trap there was a red hairy thing. And he said, "Danny, what is that? Go take a look." And I said, "I don't know what that is. I don't know what it is. Is it a caterpillar? But it's too big to be a caterpillar. It looked like a giant, like, red, hairy, almost like, stick or something." And he goes, "No, Danny, that's a fox's leg." And I said, "Why would there be a fox's leg in that trap?" And he said, "A fox got in the trap and it got frazzled up and it got so desperate that it chewed its own leg off and ran off." And I said, "Well, where is the fox?" And he said, "Well, the fox is probably about 20 yards out someplace. We'll start to smell it in a couple days and we'll but it's dead someplace. And that always stuck with me, that image of the foot, the leg in the trap, that inability to escape and the desperation that comes with it. For many people, there are many situations that I find that are incredibly troubling in life: abortion, divorce, these experiences that are terribly painful and hurtful for the individuals, for everybody involved, for children, for the spouses, for everybody involved. But they're experiences that are a product of desperation and a lack of hope, right? And again, obviously, the title of this podcast is To Smuggle Hope. So I'm hoping to do that today. But as we look at people in our life, or we are in our own situation, and maybe our own situation seems dire, is it's important that we not get into desperation, because desperation makes us do irrational and destructive things. Hence, people think they're doing a great thing sometimes. Sorry, I'm being joined by some kind of fly or something that's joined me in the studio today. So people think they're doing a great service by separating or divorcing from their spouse, or terminating their child's life. They think that this is something that they have to do. I have to divorce, and obviously, people, they don't understand like how traumatic of an event this is. So when we scale out, I mean, in many of the surveys psychologically would rank that on the top tier of traumatic events in people's lives. One of the first most stressful events, traumatic events, is the loss of a child. Then after that is the divorce, right? Divorce is really, a lot of times it shows up second or in the top tier in stressful and traumatic events in a person's life. And yet, when you think about this, at least half, if not more than half, of the general population is going through divorce. And that is troublesome, right? Because for whatever reason, that is where we're at with our society. So we walk around and we have these people, our colleagues at work, our bosses, the children's teachers, our best friends, our brothers, our sisters, our own parents, saying, I'm done. I don't want to be married anymore. Now, as a Catholic, when we're married, we're saying that we're involved in a marriage. And if you were in Mass on Sunday, Jesus was pretty strong in his language about divorce, and essentially said that he wanted people to go back to the beginning of everything, where it was, Adam and Eve in the garden. Remember, marriage is the primordial sacrament, right? So in the beginning, that is the first experience of marriage. And he basically says that, they go through the chosen people of the Israelites and the Hebrews with Moses, and Moses allowed the Jewish people to have a bill of divorce, right? That, and realistically, that was, given. Jesus says it was because of your hardness of heart that was permitted, but that was never the way that it was intended. It was always that, the two would be together. And so when people get married in the Catholic Church, I would say that a lot of people are, not necessarily formed in the correct way, right? They don't understand the seriousness of marriage. They don't understand like the permanence of marriage. Sometimes they don't come in freely. If you are living with your spouse before you get married, oftentimes that, again, people forget, if you are living with somebody and then you get married, that experience of living with the other person starts to remove your freedom in some way, because again, you're living as married people without that commitment. And so people are already participating, instead of a free and full and life-giving marriage, they're experiencing an evaluation. Or, just think about it, like over the arc of just living with another person, it's really this question of, well, are you a good fit? Are we a good fit? It's this experimental nature of cohabitation. And in some ways that appears logical, especially for a culture where half the people get divorced. Many people find themselves living with their spouse before they get married. And so that can impede people's freedom to enter into marriage freely and fully, and with the intention to be open to children in marriage. And oftentimes people are not entering into marriage in that thoughtful nature. And so in the course of their marriage, as they have children, as they experience difficulties and hardships, people, don't know how to handle it. And so people want to divorce. Now, again, a lot of times people will come to me and they'll say, well, I have to be divorced. It's what's best for my children. So we're going to talk about that. People will say, it's best for my children if I get a divorce. I want my kids, I don't want my kids to have a difficult childhood. I want to, this is a huge, I think, myth in some ways. And again, not to kind of be dismissive about this, but this attitude that we have put forth that it is best to remove yourself from your marriage so that your children can have a good childhood. Well, I want you to understand, primarily for your children to have a successful childhood, they're going to need both parents, even if one or the other parent is dysfunctional to some degree. Now we're talking about because people will have a problem with this, I think, in some regard, because there are a lot of situations where people will say, well, can't I divorce this person because they're cheating on me? Can't I divorce this person? We live in a no divorce state, like in New York, where people just get divorced because they'll just say, well, I don't have anything else left to give. I don't have anything else left to give. And really, primarily, a lot of times people have issues with unforgiveness in their marriage and resentment, and that festers and that produces cataclysmic results. And so one of the big things you want to look for in your marriage or in general is the resentment that has built, right? So if you're getting to a place of desperation, one of the first things you're going to recognize is there's resentment. Resentment is experience of refeeling things, right? To refeel an experience, to call it to mind, to bring it up. You did this to me. You did this, and the resentment produces a state where you're constantly in the past. And in the past, you can't move forward. And there might be reasons of why you're in the past, but the goal is really to be able to continue to move forward and to forgive your spouse and move forward, because that is a byproduct, that is a product of your sacramental union. If you get married as a Catholic versus you get married just as a normative person in a secular society, right? So if me and my spouse get married by the justice of the peace, well, that's not a sacrament. That's just a piece of paper, right? That just says that I'm married and we can divide assets and all this stuff. And maybe it'll work for insurance purposes and everything. But sacramental marriage, meaning that this reflects God, is not something that can just be ended, right? It can't just be ended because I'm upset with you. It can't just be ended because I'm angry. And so one of the things people forget, and again, because if you have friends that are divorced and you'll be around people, a lot of people are very, hidden about these experiences, is that for about 80% of people that get divorced, they're no happier than when they were married after the divorce, even if they get remarried, even if they get married 2, 3, or 4 times. So I need you to recognize that for the most part, the world, and when I say the world, I mean media, social media, even the psychological work that I'm doing, right? If you go on YouTube, you'll find people that are going to talk to you about how to get divorced, narcissism, all this stuff, all of the ways to justify how and why you should leave your marriage, because they could make way more money off of you if you have 2 separate houses, 2 separate things, 2 separate places where you got to buy 2 dressers for your kids, 2 TVs, 2 video game systems, 2 bunk beds, 2 whatever. You got to buy 2 of everything. Who profits? Not you. You don't make anything from that, but somebody does. Somebody in a business model makes money off of this. And again, you have people who are vulnerable in their, so whatever the case may be. And so why are people not much happier after a divorce? Well, especially if you have children with a person, is that your needs as a person, as a spouse, are needs that can only be really addressed by that other person. So if I divorced my wife and moved to another town, or, moved out of my home and moved to another place and picked up with somebody else, now I have a girlfriend, and, my kids come to see me 50% of the time, or 2 days out of the week, 3 days out of the week. I have a need, I have a desire and a need that has to be fulfilled by my wife, right? By my ex-wife at that point. And even though I may be living with a person, even though I might be even married to this new person, those needs that I have are really primarily needing to be addressed in the primary relationship of the marriage. And so I cannot necessarily get those needs met. And even in this new relationship, that new person cannot meet those needs because they do not share that primary relationship, that primary bond. And so it's not necessarily escapable. in that way. Now, that's just in a purely psychological sense. And I'm sure people could find lots of ways to say, well, I'm happy because I'm divorced. Well, then if you're happy, then you're happy. But we're not really focused necessarily on happiness so much as the fulfillment of life, right? And the ability to have a full life. And so one of the key things when it comes to divorce, especially is you got to check the resentment. If you are teetering towards divorce, if you're struggling, you feel very desperate and you're like, I feel like I need to divorce my spouse. I have nothing left to give. The first thing you need to realize is you have resentment. And if you're Catholic, get to confession and say, I resent my husband. I resent my wife. The second thing is to stop making this person responsible for your confidence or fulfillment. Because if that attitude of your spouse is not meeting your needs or your spouse is not making you happy, right, you have to make sure that you're completing that loop where you're making sure that you're living consistently with the person you want to be. And I did a whole podcast on this, I think it was Eggshells and Idolatry, about not making your spouse your God. But people do this all the time, especially when they suffer. It's almost as if, we look for ways to escape responsibility and we blame our spouse. If your marriage is struggling and you blame your spouse, again, what you've done is you have made yourself into the position of a victim, and you're going to quickly get more and more upset because you're not looking at what you can control. And so you can choose to forgive your spouse. Sometimes you have to do a lot of other work, in order to do that. And again, you don't forgive your spouse because they deserve it. You forgive your spouse so that you're free to keep moving and keep loving your family, your life, your children. Unforgiveness blocks the reception of love, right? That's why Jesus has the whole notion of forgiveness and judgment and retention of judgment, right? Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Forgive me to the degree that I forgive other people. It's in the Our Father prayer, right? And we say this every time we go to Mass. Many of us say this every day if we pray the Rosary or any other forms of prayer. If you're going to AA, you're saying the Our Father prayer. Forgive us the same way that we forgive other people. And so if I do not learn to forgive this person, and oftentimes it's very hard, well, then I'm not free. And so, it shouldn't be a surprise that you don't feel very loved in your relationship because there's a lot of resentment. And so what confession is powerful, is that forgiveness is something that is discovered first, meaning that I have to experience that I am forgiven, that I am a sinner, that I have failed, so that there's a cultivation of humility. If they're on this, desperate track towards divorce, there will be a high level of fear, a high level of resentment, and then there will be also a high level of, pride. And pride sticks to fear, right? And so people are always looking for ways to compete with their spouse, to prove why they are hurt. And they one-up each other, right? Or they dismiss each other, depending on who it is. And that's not necessarily a helpful thing, right? So I want you to keep that in perspective for yourself as we talk about this, right? And so these things become very important. Now, once you get into this kind of like pattern of pride, or you get into this pattern of fear, is you're going to start to have like the four horsemen of the relationship apocalypse appear. And these are from John Gottman's work. John Gottman and his wife, Julie Gottman, have been researching and studying marital patterns of communication for almost 40 years. And we studied a lot of their work and what works in dialogue to produce the Hearts Renewed program. But the four horsemen are, number one, criticism, right? Criticism is a judgmental expression of our needs, right? So instead of telling my wife, I'd love to be alone with you tonight without our kids so I can be close to you, I will say something like, why is the house not clean? Why is everybody running around? Why don't you ever look happy to see me? Now, the need for closeness and connection is there, but all she hears is, criticism. And criticism becomes magnified because we are unable to really be effective in our communication, right? Because there's a lot of judgment. People hear judgment and not necessarily the need. The second thing is contempt. And contempt is, something that is, I guess an example we might say is you forgot to load a dishwasher, and, really to say, you're just so lazy. You just never do that, right? And so really, to be fixed, to fix a judgment onto a person so far as to reduce them and limit their mobility. You almost kind of like break their legs with contempt. They can't be better. They're always a drunk. They're always an addict. They're always a loser. They're always fat. They're always whatever. And we bring these things up and we hurt them and we say things to hurt them. And, that contempt really limits us and locks us into the past. The third one is defensiveness. I think that many people have experienced this. Defensiveness usually leads to patterns of avoidance. And instead of being close to people, we start to pull back and pull away. And, instead of being open to people, we close up. So it's very hard to give a hug if your hands are up, right? If you're ready for a fight, because you're defending yourself. I mean, this sends the message, I don't want to be in a relationship all of the time. And over time, defensiveness makes people not want to interact. It makes people like just leave you alone. And that's really terrible in a marriage because you want your spouse to have an interest and to pursue you. But if you're defensive, again, sooner or later, your spouse is not going to present you with things. They're not going to be vulnerable with you. And this is hard. Even in my own marriage, like for my wife to express her needs or for me to express my needs, and sometimes we get it wrong, or the person expresses their needs and we get defensive or we get touchy because we hear more criticism than anything, and we pull and we shrink away. So again, that's why we designed the program that we did, to give people language so they can bypass all of these things, especially the defensiveness. And then the fourth dimension here is what we call, stonewalling. So stonewalling is when a person shuts down in a conversation. It can happen because they're really sleep deprived, and for a lot of people, especially people with young parents or spouses that are taking care of ailing parents, or you're working the night shift. When somebody doesn't want to, deal with an argument, they just shut down and, they just don't communicate. And, we don't want people to shut down, because once they do, it's kind of like, again, we feel helpless. And usually that makes us angry or feel depressed or feel unloved. So those are the four horsemen of the relationship apocalypse. And they start to show up for people when they're getting into this desperate mode. And so I think, again, wherever you are, to some degree, all marriages, even healthy marriages, have versions of these guys show up. But healthy marriages do not, operate in this way as frequently, right? So if your marriage is in trouble, these four things are going to be showing up all of the time. And again, that's why, again, we want there to be a level of humility. As a Catholic, you need to recognize that your marriage is not even about you. It's actually supposed to be about God. And so if you're fixated on your spouse and you're getting contemptuous on your spouse, that they've hurt you, and you're bringing up the past and you're talking about how they've screwed everything up, or you just don't want to participate anymore or whatnot, all of that is, you really want to draw back into, number one, the person that you want to be, especially at the end of your life. How do they handle things? How can you get on track with that person? And again, if you can, that will create more confidence, because you're measuring what you can control. You can't control your spouse. You can choose to love them or not. And yet that is really the choice. The choice is really only to, if you love a person, is to will the good for them. And so again, going back to this notion earlier of, I feel like, divorce is something I need to do. Maybe your husband is got a drug problem or an alcohol problem, or he's angry or miserable. Again, if it is not a safety-related issue, okay, so safety-related issue means that your husband is physically beating you, that is a safety issue. Your wife is chronically threatening to kill herself or is addicted to drugs. Those are safety issues, right? Safety issues, physical violence, domestic violence, sexual abuse, all of those things. You're going to find a lot more relief by removing yourself from that situation for survival, right? So if you're listening to this and you're contemplating divorce because of a physical abuse situation or drug addiction situation where the person is acting out violently, there's different levels of intensity. But if it's a safety related issue to your children and yourself, okay, then most likely the best thing for you to do is to leave for the safety of your children and yourself, because you're at risk. If your husband is drunk and makes poor decisions and passes out on the couch, should you leave him? Well, the answer is that a safety related issue? Do you still want your husband to take interest in your children? Take them to soccer practice. Do you want your husband and you to be able to go on dates? Well, maybe you would say, well, that's not possible because my husband, well, but that means that is there a desire for that type of relationship? And so should you leave? I mean, you can choose to leave and divorce your husband or divorce your wife for that matter. The issue becomes, whether or not this relationship was made in the eyes of God and his church. And if you fully were committed to being married to death do you part, well, then, you're going to continue to be married to this person, even if you are not living with them. And the judge in the county you live in says that you're legally divorced. And now you live in an apartment or a different house or whatever your custody arrangement is. No, it doesn't mean that God says that you're divorced. This means a judge did. And so for a lot of people, again, I think that if it's a safety related issue, yes, I encourage people to get counsel on how to do that safely and effectively so that you have some relief from that situation so your children and you are kept safe. But there is a lot of gray area oftentimes where people are just headlong in sin, right? Women having affairs, right? Men having affairs, addictions to gambling, drugs of different sorts. And so in that situation, again, your responsibility as the spouse is number one, to do what pleases God. Because if you're a Catholic, your marriage is actually about God and reflecting the mercy of God, right? So I always find this fascinating. So I was raised in a home where my father would probably be the person that most people, I think, you would think. So my mother is a very, I would say, godly woman and a very holy woman in the sense that she's a person of prayer. And my father, for most of my life, as a young man, especially, like he had significant problems with alcoholism, to put it mildly, and a lot of other issues. And I think many people would have just left him. And what I've discovered is the fact that my mother loved my father, in spite of the fact that he was a dysfunctional person in a lot of ways, promoted in me the idea and the understanding that marriage is a permanent thing and that essentially it's not about the individual, right? My parents' marriage wasn't about my mother's happiness. It wasn't about my father's happiness. Neither one of them escaped. What I saw in my parents' marriage, I'm happy to say, is God. I saw my mother love my father, even though my father could be at his worst a wretch of a person. And again, God permitted all of that. And I'm not saying that I would seek that out. I don't think my mother even sought that out. But I think that that was what was permitted. And so in your marriage, again, without the spiritual understanding, if it's just about your happiness, well, yeah, you're going to get divorced 2, 3, 4, 5 times. Nobody is responsible for your happiness, primarily, like, except for you. And happiness by itself is dangerous because we're not necessarily made for this. We're not made, just to be happy. God isn't concerned about our happiness as much as he's more concerned about us growing up and reflecting the mercy of God in our marriage. So he permits difficulties. Your spouse will make your character develop. And yes, I really wish that marriages were easy, but marriage is hard. Even my own marriage, I'm sure, is hard for my wife to live with me because I'm not a perfect person, nor would I would say that she is a perfect person. She wouldn't say that. But again, like I find that, again, that's why you try to marry somebody who will inspire you to be a better man or a better woman. But when stuff is difficult, again, because in marriage, it's not something that you can escape if it is a Catholic marriage, unless, again, there was something that you did not understand about the person. In the case that you married a person and they lied to you about having a same-sex attraction, and you married this person, they never disclosed that, and now you have a child with them, and it turns out that they have a second life, and your husband has a boyfriend that he goes to see once a week. Well, that's grounds for annulment because you did not know that your husband had this attraction and he never brought it up. And before you got married, you had no knowledge. So you did not go into that marriage freely. On the other hand, if you marry a person and you know that this person prior to getting married struggled with alcohol or whatnot, but you accepted that would be a part of your marriage, and you went in knowingly that that was something that person could struggle with, and at the time you got married, They did not demonstrate that they were struggling with that. Well, if they do at some point end up struggling with alcohol or drugs or whatever it is, you were aware of it. You had full knowledge of that, and that's not something that you could escape. Now, again, every diocese, if you're looking as a Catholic person to get a divorce, again, like I said, that is something that the world will recognize. It does not mean that that God Himself will recognize. And so, what are the people who make the decisions, so to speak, or help to, I shouldn't say make the decisions, they do the investigation on the what we call feasibility for annulment are people on the marriage tribunal. And those people decide, based on investigation, whether or not a marriage really took place, or if people were impaired, or there was an impediment to freedom to enter into the marriage. And so again, you have to look at your marriage. If your marriage you entered into freely, and if you entered into it with the intention of it being a lifetime commitment, I think you need to be recognizing the need for the sacramental graces of confession. You want to be looking at a way to forgive your spouse and to free yourself from these resentments that may choke the love out of your life. And if you're concerned about your children and the fact that they're not having a wonderful childhood, realize that it's not about having a wonderful childhood. It's about allowing your children to be prepared for reality and life. And yes, your children are going to have difficulties and hardships, and their life will be difficult. But how you experience that, right? How you interact with that reality has a huge impact, right? So again, if my mother and my father, when my father has passed away, but if in the worst moments of their life, I just saw my mother constantly like resenting God and freaked out and, screaming and carrying on. Well, that would set the tone to me of terror as a kid, but I didn't see that in my mother would turn to God and to prayer, sometimes to other people for support if my father was not doing well. But I did not, and again, I don't think, again, it was hardship, and I don't think that it was something that I would have desired. I obviously don't desire that for my own children, but it is, like, again, God permits it, but His desire is for people to grow up. So we got to get rid of this whole idea of trying to control our children's childhood and prevent all difficulties, right? Yes, I don't want my children in dangerous situations. I don't think anybody, if your kids are in danger, then you need to leave the home. If you're in danger, leave the home, get divorced, figure out your marital stuff afterwards. But if this is just that you're just exhausted, or you've been married for 20 years, or your husband can't get his crap together, or he's depressed, or she's depressed, or he doesn't want to be close to you, or she doesn't want to sleep in the bed, or you know, you know, they're carrying on with somebody else. Well, then you have to figure out, what is this marriage about? Is this about God, or is this about myself? And when we're suffering, we're most tempted to selfishness. And that's why a lot of this is very challenging, because we all suffer in our marriages, and that makes us think about ourselves. So that's why prayer is such an important component, and not just prayer, but having a clear vision of who we want to be so that we can operate freely in our marriage to love our spouse, even if our spouse is screwed up. And inevitably, at times, they may be very screwed up. It does not mean that that is grounds to leave them or say, like, I don't want to be with you. And so what a lot of people do is, in those moments of difficulty and hardship, they go, well, I don't want to deal with this. Okay. And then they just stop this relationship. They divorce this person, but this relationship isn't done. And then they either have a new relationship or they get divorced. But what they do is they have another cross, right? They had one cross, which was their marriage, and now they have another cross, or even a heavier cross. Usually it's a heavier cross because they have to be responsible now to the first relationship that was still going on. And if there's children involved, that's even more challenging. And then they have other relationships which thrust more responsibilities. And so it's kind of an important component. So when you think about these experiences with your children, especially, it's not about having like these happy, joyful childhoods so much as we do not want our children we don't want our children to be in danger, but we also don't want our children to be fragile. I may not have had like the most cookie cutter, lovely childhood, but I am not pushover. I'm also not fragile. And you'll see a lot of these people, they've put their children, they removed these people from they decided that, well, I was unhappy and me and my spouse yelled at each other and we yelled at each other in front of our kids. So we decided to get a divorce. Well, these kids, they grow up into adults, and these adults now are super fragile and can't handle conversations that are real, can't handle conflict, so they are avoidant, and now their relationships are really difficult. So now we've got generations of people that really, when things are difficult, they don't know what to do, so they just try to escape. So if they're dating, they just don't want to deal with it, or they just escape, or they think that divorce is some kind of a problem-solving method for how to escape a relationship. And so again, you need to be mindful about, like, what is my marriage about? Right? Is my marriage about God, or was it about me? Is it about me being happy, or is it about me living a good life? So if you teach your kids that life is about their happiness, then I would say you're setting your kids up for failure, because if you are an adult, you realize that life really it's not all about happiness. It's about sacrifice primarily. Sacrifice while you're working your 2 jobs, while you're trying to keep your wits about you, save up for Christmas, get ready to deal with your in-laws, get ready for new work, do whatever, taking your kids to gymnastics, karate, whatever. Life is about sacrifice. It's not about me kicking back and being happy all the time. And that sacrifice produces meaning if the sacrifice is in union with the person I want to be, meaning like that sacrifice is meaningful. There's a lot of sacrifice in this life that people make that is intuitively unhelpful and destructive, right? So our kids need to be asked the question, I think it's even more important, ask the question, how do you live a good life? Not how do you be happy? Well, I had to divorce your father. I had to divorce your mother because I wanted to be happy. Okay. Well, are you though? And like I told you, the results are in. People are not happy after most people aren't. The only that 20% or maybe 25% of people that are happy after their divorce are actually happy because they're leaving a situation that was abusive, violent. Their spouse was gambling away their home. They didn't know what was going to happen, and they physically had to get away. And it doesn't mean that they're happier, like woo woo, I'm going to Disney World, but they're in a place of at least relief because they're not in survival mode. A lot of the issues that are affecting our marriages are not always on survival mode. They're on the area of, I don't want to be uncomfortable. I don't want to have to sacrifice. I don't want to change my bad behavior, right? And again, that's not helpful. If you are contemplating divorce, the other thing I wanted to say before I'm done with this episode is if you're contemplating divorce, or you're saying that word out loud, that's like taking a knife out in a fight, right? As soon as you take that word out and say divorce or separation, it escalates everything. It just escalates everything. I see people destroy their relationships all the time like this because they say it and it goes up. And if you really want to end your relationship, keep talking about these things, because it will keep the contempt, the defensiveness, the stonewalling, the criticism at a very high level. So you really want to remove that from your vocabulary. The other thing is, you do not want to associate with people who are already divorced if you're struggling in your marriage. Those people are an environmental factor that will destroy your confidence and make you believe that divorce is appealing because they've gone through it. But remember, they never solved the problem in their marriage. What their solution was divorce. And so you're looking at the fox with no leg telling you, yeah, you don't need your leg. And what is it going to say? You shouldn't get divorced? Again, because once you do these behaviors, you have to justify the change in life, because it radically changes your life. It radically changes your life forever, really, unless something changes. And so when people leave their spouse, people divorce their spouse, again, you can forget your identity, but you cannot forget your responsibility. So the past haunts you. I don't care if you move across the country and never remarry or whatever it is, or you have 5 marriages with other people. You cannot forget your responsibility. You're connected to this person in some form or fashion. And especially if there are children involved, you're going to find this way more challenging intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. And so you do not want to surround yourself with people who are already divorced. because they will counsel you unintentionally, they will counsel you into divorce because they lost confidence in their primary relationship, and they do not, at this point, any longer probably support marriage because it didn't work out for them. And that is not to blame those people by any stretch. It is just, you need to understand that tactically, that people have blind spots where it is that there is pain. And so unless you're with somebody who's super integrated and was divorced 40 years ago and learned something and can tell you why they got divorced and how marriage should have worked differently, which I do not think is the majority of people's friendships when they're in these dire states, you really want to be around people that care about you or are supportive of marriage, because otherwise they're going to counsel you in the wrong direction. What I find in my own field is that a lot of people in my field find it very permissible to just always counsel people almost entirely into divorce. And I don't know specifically why that is. I don't know if it's just that people don't feel like they have the skill set to counsel people in another direction. But I find I've referred over the course of my career to different practitioners. Some of them are Catholic, some of them are Christian, some of them, it doesn't matter what denomination or what orientation, but especially secular people, it's all about happiness. It's all about be you, be free, be independent. There's no interest, your kids will have to kind of deal with everything. It's all about your happiness. So again, happiness is not going to be what life is about, because your life will be over. And your life, regardless of whether or not you're in marriage or not, your life will have suffering attached to it. And you'll either do things that are meaningful, or you're going to do things that are not meaningful and just what we call expedient, which is the happiness thing. And so that's why in this world right now, you see people that really are struggling. They're struggling terribly because they don't know what is meaningful. And when you remove yourself from a place where there's difficulty, okay, your spouse has a struggle with depression, your husband or your wife has a struggle with alcohol, your husband has cancer, your wife has this injury and she's not going to be, whatever it is, right? You have a child with a disability. These sufferings that God permits are for our character and for us to be responsible and to produce meaning and to become like Him. When we say, I don't want to do this, I don't want to be a part of this, what we do is we start to remove the meaning from our life. And so, yes, we can go get happiness, but that isn't going to stop life. That isn't going to stop the suffering. It will compound it. And I don't think people understand this. I think that they think that there's some way out of suffering. And that is just not the case in this life, right? We can mitigate it by doing what is responsible and what is loving in our given situation. And so if you're stuck in a marriage where you're like, okay, I don't know what to do, my life, like I just feel like I got to divorce my husband. He yells, he does this, he does that. Okay. Again, if it's not a safety issue, again, I strongly encourage you to really think about and pray about, what is it that will please God so that you're not, freaking out. Maybe you're going to need to get support from counsel or from a priest or from somebody else. Because your spouse is depressed or has problems upset with work or whatever it is. But again, like that is still your spouse, right? This is, if you've made this public commitment to God and before everybody that you're going to be with this person, well, it's going to be a great challenge. And just because you say, I don't want to be married, doesn't mean that you're not married. Many people are, I see people all the time, they're still married, they're divorced, they've been divorced for years. And I can tell that they still love their spouse because they always talk negatively about them, or they get upset with them, or they get angry about them. And they just have to acknowledge the fact that they love that person, but they have to get angry to push that person away. It's always the sign, right? That I get irritated by them. I get angry. They agitate me. Well, I only get agitated with somebody that I have a relationship with. I can only have conflict really with somebody I have a relationship. And so for many people, they just won't acknowledge, right? They won't acknowledge the fact that they still love this person, and they don't know how to love that person. And that's really still something that they have to work out, even if they're divorced, right? They might have to pray for that person, all of that stuff. They might have to, figure out, ways to co-parent, a whole lot of complex stuff. But again, contemplating divorce and you're a Catholic person, remember your marriage was not about you. It was about God when you got married. It was indissoluble till death do you part. And essentially, it is designed to make you sacrifice and display the mercy of God. It is not about making you happy. Again, if you want to have a life-giving marriage, there are specific tactics to take that far exceed like this podcast. So check out the other dimensions of this podcast that we talk about marriage and how to have an affair with your spouse and how to create desire, or take that $1 challenge to do the Hearts Renewed program so that you can look at how to recover all of that. Because you can recover a marriage, right, from that place, but you can't recover things once you don't forgive your spouse, right? The contempt is the worst of those four things. I've seen many people with the contempt kill their marriage, and it makes them justify having affairs. It makes them justify all types of stuff because they just will not and cannot forgive their spouse. No matter how hard their spouse tries, they keep on bringing up that they hate them or they can't forgive them. And that is dangerous spiritually. Remember, it's forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So we have to figure out how to love our spouse. And again, if you don't want to figure that out because you think that there's a loophole for you, well, again, that's something that you're going to have to discover. And some people will listen to everything that I've said on this episode, and they are going to continue to be justified. Or again, if you've listened to this podcast and you're angry by something I've said, I think it's important that maybe you send me an email. You can send it to the handle on Spotify or right on YouTube, that you got that something was upsetting about this. But again, I'm not here to challenge why you got divorced or challenge why you're getting divorced. Again, I don't make that decision. It's God. If you got married in front of God, you're still married unless there was no marriage. Because what God is bound together, no person can separate. So all the annulment process does is reveal that no marriage took place. It just discovers no marriage took place. But if you sat before God and committed to this person for your whole life, and yeah, things were really hard, and you said, I don't really want to deal with that. I'd rather be happy. I'd rather find somebody else who I have no baggage with because I have no children with them. Well, yeah, that's not your life. Of course it's going to be easier. It's always easier to have an affair than it is to deal with your actual life because there is no actual life with this other person. There's just romance with this person or your expression of a secret self or a part of yourself that you haven't experienced in a long time, but you're going to play it out with this person. But you've got other people, right? You've got this other person with an actual life. And so I challenge you, if you can, I really do challenge you to return to prayer if you're struggling in your marriage. Take up a weekly, if not daily, holy hour if your marriage is in jeopardy. If you're a husband, you really want to strive for a daily holy hour every day. Commit yourself back to the person that you want to be at the end of your life. Think about that man or that woman that you want to be at the end of your life so that you are really on track. So your confidence is coming from that person and the movement towards that person versus just trying to please your spouse. Because even if your spouse is drinking, having an affair, carrying on, struggling with gambling, struggling with pornography, whatever it is, you should not stop becoming that person that you are supposed to be. You can always do what pleases God. That's really that is what holiness is. And marriage is supposed to make us holy by moving towards the person God intended us to be. It has nothing to do with whether or not our spouse has their act together. For you to have a great marriage, or specifically like holy marriage, that you need to keep moving towards that person that you want to be at the end of your life and evolve and not be stuck and angry because this person is failed, or we're going through financial hardships, or we're going through depression, or our daughter or our son has an issue, or a child has died, or any number of tragedies and difficulties. We don't just abandon people. God doesn't abandon us. So how can we abandon our spouse, especially when they're struggling? And so again, if there's only one thing that you take away from this episode is if you're a Catholic person and you are struggling in your marriage, go to confession in the next 24 hours, go to confession in the next week, whenever you can, and tell the priest, I resent my spouse, and ask God for the grace to, again, be free to start moving towards the person you want to be and to love them the way God wants to love them. You may not feel like you can do that. but God will give you the grace, because that's the whole point of marriage. And so do not be discouraged. If you are discouraged, remember that always comes from pride. And so again, for those of you that are listening to this and you're like, no, I have to be divorced, because if you are, again, if it's a safety issue, your spouse is abusing you, abusing your children physically, you're being harmed at home, there's dangers of substances at home where, they're driving, whatever it is, that's going on, well, then remove yourself from that situation. But again, it's hard to tell even then. Yes, remove yourself from the situation. Maybe a divorce legally is important, but I don't know if you're going to necessarily say that you're still not married. You might have a person who's, maybe they're drinking and driving, and maybe you do have to separate for a while so that your children are safe and you are safe. Or maybe your husband has gambled away everything that you have, and maybe that's something you knew, that back in his 20s and early 30s, like before he got married, like he liked to play blackjack and he had gone into debt $60,000, and so you still married him, and now he's racked up a ton of debt, and now you might lose your house. Well, that's terrible. That's terrible, and maybe you'll have to divorce him so that you can keep your assets. It doesn't mean that you might legally separate, but you may not necessarily it may not necessarily mean that the marriage is over in the eyes of God. That has to do with, again, your intent going in, your freedom going into the marriage, and your knowledge of your spouse. And again, I will pray for all of you who are listening to this episode, or those of you that are going to share this with other people. But I really want people to understand that we're not supposed to just tap out from our marriages because it's difficult. And please don't hide behind the idea that our kids are going to be unhappy in this marriage, or they're going to be upset. Yes, your kids are going to be upset and they're going to be unhappy in every family dynamic. And frankly, if we want them to not be fragile, they're going to have to see and go through difficult stuff. There is no benefit in hiding your children from difficulties, just to keep them from the fact that life is hard. Yes, life is hard, but mommy or daddy still love you. God still exists. Yes. And so make sure you advocate for the faith, and that you realize it's an opportunity to demonstrate the faith. Like I told you in this episode, like I learned the faith, I think, in a lot of ways from the way that my mother loved my father, even though he was very dysfunctional in a lot of ways. And that is not something that I think that she was maybe even aware of. And maybe she doubted herself, or thought maybe that she was doing something wrong as a parent. But I would say that was one of the biggest impacts of making me a resilient person over the arc of my life, and really believing in marriage and seeing that marriage is something that can thrive even in difficulty. So do not be afraid to love your spouse, but you're going to have to forgive them if they've hurt you. And you're going to have to do it over and over and over again till death do you part. But abandon this idea of your happiness, your happiness, your happiness. That is a marketing ploy of Americana. And it's a great way to make a mass of people very miserable very easily, and then to fracture us all as a society. So if you have your feedback or further commentary, please send them to me. Like I said, I will pray for you. Please pray for me. Again, my only goal in today's episode is primarily for those of you who are really struggling in the throes of divorce to just realize you probably don't need to throw in the towel. Some of you, maybe it's a safety issue. You might have to separate. You might have to, maybe legally get divorced. It does not mean that you're going to, pretend that you're not married at all. Like, what God has bound together, no one can separate, regardless of what the judge says. So please, again, and if you have gone through these experiences, and again, 50% of people have, realize this is not an attack on you or the decisions you've made. Again, if you are a divorced person and you are living as a divorced person, just realize that in this current state, figure out what to do that is loving and responsible, and continue to move towards that woman or that man that you want to be, so that if you have to be around your spouse or your ex, or the mother or father of your child, that you are able to move freely and lovingly so that you can continue to be holy. Remember, holiness is not something that is limited to just one state in life. You can be holy wherever you are. You just have to start doing what pleases God. It's not about pleasing yourself. It's not about pleasing your kids. It's about pleasing Him. And if you can remember that, you're going to have a lot less of a burden. So I'll be praying for you all. And again, pray for me, and I will see you back here in a week's time. So smuggle some hope wherever you can.